Hi, everyone. Ooh, loud. I'm Katy Daigle. I am the Global Climate and Environment Editor at Reuters, and I am here with a fantastic panel. We have Adam Vaughan of New Scientist, Chief Reporter. Chris Michael, who for 6 years was the Cities Editor at The Guardian and now is Oceans Editor. And Dayana Sarkisova, who is the Climate Solutions Editor at The Washington Post. And we are here to talk, of course, about solutions journalism. For those who aren't familiar with it, these are generally stories that are describing positive news, ways of solving climate change, ways humanity is either working now to solve climate change or ideas that they might pursue. And they're often called positive stories, right? Stories that generate hope because they tap into human industry, agency, ingenuity, people surmounting odds, rising above challenges, making magic out of, the mundane. We all love those stories. Anybody who's watched the Olympics, we see these stories all the time. But in fact, climate journalists have been writing solution stories for decades in a way. We have been covering renewable energy, solar power, wind power. We have been covering policies that end deforestation or minimize deforestation. And of course, we've also been there to report on stories about geoengineering or some of the more kind of experimental out there ideas, solar sails in the stratosphere. That was pretty much the beat for a long time, and in recent years, it's become much more complicated. And we've heard a little bit this morning about some of the rationale for why we might want to write solution stories, and now we are going to talk about the reality of it. So I wanted to ask you guys, let's start with Adam. What is a solution story to you? What boxes does it have to tick? And how do you know when you've got one? How's it different from other stories?
I guess I don't, in a way, I don't think of it as different to our other stories. I think it's sort of part of the light and shade of our overall editorial mix. It's, along a lot of our bread and butter, as a science magazine, a lot of our bread and butter daily stories are what I generally call the doomsday beat. It's generally pretty freaking miserable. So that is, for me, it is about offering some contrast of that, and that tends to take the form of, sometimes it's news pieces, it's analysis, it's features, podcasts. One format I found works really well, and I've heard other people at this festival say is newsletters. I write one called Fix the Planet. Please go and sign up. You will get me in your inbox every week and regret it. I find they're a really good fit for the format, for this sort of journalism, because often solutions journalism in the climate space, to my mind, doesn't fit the grammar of a news story very well. Quite often, by its nature, it's quite early doors, it's a bit tentative, there might not necessarily be a very good news peg of why now. So I find that works very well. I also find it's very good for story sourcing, so you get a lot of feedback, and it's, quite often my future newsletters are led by what readers have said they're interested in. I think for me, it's, a really high level. I think a journalist's job is to, accurately reflect what's happening in the world, and that's what this does for me is, yes, the big picture is quite dark, CO2 emissions are still rising, sometimes extreme weather are obviously becoming more intense and more frequent, but at the same time, a lot of good stuff is happening. There are technologies, there are ideas, there are individuals, there are companies, communities doing stuff, and I think it's our job to give space to them.
Dayana, what about, The Guardian has a whole department now for it, on which you're on top of. How do you frame solutions for your audience?
For us in our climate solutions vertical.
Post. Sorry.
Yeah, at the Post.
Yeah.
I guess we do a large mix of the types of pieces we run, but I think that the underlying thread would be we really look for stories that, it's very important to me that readers will come away feeling empowered from the pieces. So it's a little bit less positivity, more empowerment on the subject that is obviously, very depressing. And like I said, we do that through various types of articles. So we have a lot of profiles. We focus on people and organizations around the world who are working toward climate solutions. But we also do a lot of utility journalism. So, for people that are interested in implementing climate solutions in their own life, giving them, the answers that they need to be able to do that.
Such as,
If you're debating switching to an electric vehicle, and you don't know where to start, hopefully, we will have a guide to that. Like, if you would like to put solar panels on your own home, but you have no idea where to start, those climate solutions at the individual level, kind of just providing the answers there.
practical advice. We all covered the IPCC to some extent last week, or throughout the decades, but also last week a big report dropped. It could be called a solutions report, in the sense that it carved out what we need to do going forward, and it is a lot. It's pretty daunting. It makes the idea of doing positive news on climate even a little bit trickier, right? Because there's a more narrow window. How do you navigate that, Chris, at the Guardian?
Well, I mean, that's difficult. There's a lot. Is that on? Oh. Hello. Sorry. Well, first of all, I mean, the Guardian has loads of different people working in lots of different ways, and there is a sort of solutions vertical, as the Americans would say, which is called The Upside and is newsletter oriented as well, and has built a really great community of people who respond to the stories that we publish. It's a bit like good news journalism. It's sort of trying to find the light in all the shade. But there's also, lots of other ways in which solutions journalism happens. So the Guardian's editor has a sort of 5-pillar approach to journalism, and one of them is that every story should have some solutions element to it. So it's built in. I totally agree with Adam. It's kind of built into what we do on a regular basis.
I think, I don't want to plug other publications type things too much, but I think the thing I really like about The Upside is it starts with the problem rather than the solution, and I think that is the sort of guiding light, good principle to remember.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of good news journalism really doesn't do very well because, I don't know, it's something about the human condition. We're looking for problems, and so you sort of want to start, I find, with a problem and then move into the ways in which not it's being solved, but constructive things are being done to address it and whether or not those things are working. So, straight, I mean, there is obviously no sort of solution to, on the macro level, the climate crisis other than everybody getting together and stopping it. You can't do a story on the solution to the climate crisis. It's sort of somewhere a little bit lower down than that.
Mm-hmm. I often get accused of being a bit of a bummer for saying that solution stories are really still about the problem. But it speaks to the question of scale, which of course we all grapple with when we're writing these stories, and it can make a story, palatable versus, fantastical. Can you talk a little bit about how scale fits into how you frame stories, or whether you do stories, in fact?
Scale, I suppose for me, I tend to, maybe it's a little bit crude, but the most sort of important metric when I'm writing about a so-called sort of climate solutions journalism story is greenhouse gas emissions, and I think the beauty in a way of this, as opposed to solutions journalism about a crime epidemic or a mental health problem in one town or the t'other, that quite often the metrics for that would be there might be many metrics, and they might sometimes be quite qualitative rather than quantitative. The kind of joy about carbon emissions is greenhouse gas emissions is that you can see the numbers, right? And we know that, the report you were talking about, spells out that, humanity was responsible for 60 billion tons of CO2 emissions in 2019, CO2 equivalent. Sorry, Science magazine, I have to, I get told off about conflating methane and stuff. And so, my point being, it's kind of wonderful in a way because that gives you a yardstick to measure everything against. And Hans Rosling's book, Factfulness, which if you haven't read already, I highly recommend you go and buy a copy on your Kindle or paperback. That is really good about this, about always having more than one number, right? Okay, and you can't have numbers on isolation. And so an example would be Climeworks, who are a Swiss organisation you might have heard of. They had a big glitzy thing in September in Iceland with the Prime Minister of Iceland and blah, 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 and the greater good. And it's the world's largest direct air capture plant. So it's like, it has little machines with doors and there's like a sorbent inside, and the CO2 the tiny sort of vanishingly dilute amounts of CO2 in the air go in and it gets sucked in, and then it actually ends up in rock eventually. And anyway, that's meant to like remove like 4,000 tons of CO2 a year. So all you need to do is just do a very quick percentage calculation, and you can see how, yes, that may be a solution one day, but clearly the scale as it is at the moment, it's well beyond. I mean, like the report that Katy was mentioning this week, that says that we need 4 billion tons a year of that already, every year until the end of the century. And we're on like the biggest plant in the world at the moment is doing 4,000, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think about scale in terms of, Dayana was talking about how individuals can feel empowered to do something. And then there's obviously the sort of macro scale that Adam's talking about. When we were doing cities, there was a sort of in-between area where one of the great things about urban journalism is that cities share a lot in common. Obviously, every individual place is different, but you can do a lot of stories about one thing happening in one place that other cities could then adopt. So you sort of extrapolate scale by finding a great example of something that a city is doing. For example, going car-free. One of our best stories ever was about Pontevedra, a Spanish city that has essentially gone car-free, and what that experience is like. And we heard from loads of other cities about how reading that story inspired them to try to take on some of these challenges. And you can also see how different places respond to a problem differently. Like, in terms of sort of flooding mitigation, I don't know if you'd call this a solution story, but we did a piece about Rotterdam and Ho Chi Minh City, comparing the two. So basically, they both face flooding issues, and some of you would probably know a lot more about the details than I would, but Rotterdam is treating the fact of rising sea levels by essentially creating a floating city that it sort of sits on the dock and can rise with the waters. Ho Chi Minh City does not have the same level of sort of technical experience or resource. Their way of dealing with it is to accept the fact that flooding is going to happen and design homes and buildings so that the first floor can flood in a safe way. And so there's no upholstery and no sort of furniture that can be damaged. And you sort of end up treating the city as though it's almost already on stilts. And so some kind of those are both two radically different ways of approaching the same problem, but lots of other cities can kind of learn from that. So it's, like somewhere in between, I suppose.
I think, sorry to just jump in, I think the thing as well that Chris's point there makes is as well is a reminder that with climate solutions journalism, it's often very rooted in place, and there is not one solution. It's not like global solutions that work everywhere. That came up quite a lot in some of the earlier situations, in some of the earlier sessions in regards to India and farming and air pollution and things there. So I think it's just a reminder that you need to root these stories in a place. You can't say like this is how everyone will live in a home, like in the future. For example, in the UK is very different to a low-income country, in sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah.
That's why Silicon Valley is so annoying, because they assume that everybody lives in San Diego and all the roads look like that, and it just doesn't work.
It's interesting. The examples that you're mentioning are things that are happening, right? There's action, there's money deployed already, there's a commitment, and maybe it's already done. But of course, as climate change becomes a bigger issue, we are getting more and more ideas percolating. Things that haven't yet been proven, things that haven't been tested, that don't have money behind them yet. How do you vet those ideas, whether or not to do them, which are worthy of doing?
I think that as an editor, one thing that I try to stay away from completely pretty much is PR pitches for those types of initiatives. Of course, every once in a while, like there's something that we should pursue that, lands in your inbox, but I definitely rely on reporters to go out and find these initiatives instead. I think that so often it is done at an individual level and not necessarily like, this big shiny startup maybe or something. And so finding these individuals and the effect that they're having on their community versus, their stat sheet for like a startup is how we tend to go about choosing who we're going to profile for our Climate Visionary series.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. I mean, you know, the intent behind a project is really interesting, and you know, we'll all be in the same boat. A lot of what comes across our desk is, you know, is sort of PR related. You know, a lot of it could be accused of greenwashing, and you know, in the cities space, the big topic that, you know, we really need to be very careful about is the concept of smart cities, which are often pitched as a solution to the climate crisis. You know, you'll be able to move through a city more efficiently, you know.
I bet Siemens were involved.
I was going to say Siemens. Apologies to anybody who might work for Siemens or any of the other big corporations who are involved in the space. But, you know, and it's not to say that any individual project that they're pushing might be a terrible idea. Google had this project that they were going to do in Toronto around the waterfront, and you know, it genuinely sort of innovated in some ways and made for a slightly greener space. But you know, you need to kind of pull back a little bit and think about what the motivation is, and clearly the motivation for smart cities development is that cities are ballooning around the world. So you know, you've all heard the fact that 50% of humanity now lives in cities. It's going to be 2 out of every 3 people pretty soon. That, you know, as they're also drivers of wealth to an unprecedented degree. That means that the municipal budgets are ballooning as well, and there's just loads of money sloshing around. And that attracts corporations, and a lot of the smart city stuff is corporations just trying to get a piece of that municipal budget. So if you go to other conferences, smart cities conferences, of which I kid you not, there's one every 2 days, I would say. They're kind of like, there's usually a veneer of intellectual conversation around why it is that smart cities are a good idea for the planet. But really what they are is trade shows, and they're ways for city employees, you know, who control the purse strings to get together with corporations who are selling products. So it is important.
So while fully echoing Chris and Diana on the PR point, I'm going to freely hold my hand up and say I have done stories that started with a press officer getting in touch.
Yeah.
Because, you know, in some cases, like, you know, like say with an energy company, they maybe can have access to people or places that you can't go, frankly, without them. So I'm just going to be upfront about that while wholeheartedly endorsing not doing too many if you can help it. But I mean, I think, you know, I usually use it as a jumping off point rather than the thing, if you see what I mean. I think to your question, Katie, I mean, the 2 things I try to do is, has something happened? You know, has something been built? Has some money been invested or committed? Has a final investment decision been made? Or is a company just talking about making an FID later down the line? That to me, you know, is the crucial thing. You know, and I try generally, by and large, I try not to cover like purely conceptual things. But you know, like the other day, I wrote about space-based solar power. So this idea of like, you know, robots assembling like a massive like armada of solar panels like orbiting Earth, and then this is actually a UK-backed idea, and then there's like a massive antennae on Earth which should actually be it was lots of square kilometers. It's something like crazy, like 96 square kilometers in the North Sea, basically a giant net, and you'd beam the energy down as you turn it into radio waves, and you beam it down, and then you'd have a 24/7 solar power. And like, you know, it's all largely at the conceptual stage. Apart from the reason I wrote about it was the UK government is starting to take it seriously, and they've like they commissioned, you know, they paid for a study on it. It's now got like buy-in from parliamentarians, you know. So, you know, I think that is, again, to me, it was like, okay, is there something tangible I can point out here that this is maybe a thing as opposed to just an idea?
Yeah.
So that, yeah. That
It was also in a Brad Pitt movie.
was it? Which one?
Oh, God, what's it called?
I can't
remember what
remember.
it's called.
I like Brad.
Space
but
one. Anyway, but it brings me to the next question, and that's about science. Is science a part of this beat? And if so, do you guys have any advice for reporters who might not have a background in science reporting? How do they go about tackling these?
Yes, science is absolutely part of this. One of our climate solutions reporters actually went on to move into a science reporting beat, and it's just very clear, you know, her knowledge and how much it infuses into a piece. But one thing I do want to like say about science reporting and those may be interested into going into climate journalism is I wouldn't say that it's a prerequisite, like having a background in science reporting or even having like a deep knowledge of science. I think that one of the pitfalls, potential pitfalls in this type of work is assuming that a reader knows just as much as the reporter does when they're writing the piece. It's how we get into these nitty-gritty paragraphs in the middle of an article that make people just peace out. And so I think that it's important to remember, like, it's important for reporters to remember that if you have a question, you know, in the science space, the odds are, like, the reader will too. And so just going through the avenues of reporting and research and asking these questions and, like, getting answers to things you don't know is the whole job. So it doesn't have to, like, it doesn't have to be a level of knowledge that you already brought to it.
Yeah, definitely. I think my key skill as an editor is being really ignorant.
So I'm obviously going to say it's integral, right? Because I work on a science magazine, so I'm putting myself out of a job. So, I mean, I suppose the caveat I would add to that, and then I'll come to the concrete tip stuff, is, I mean, our editor, Emily Wilson, her sort of shtick is that science shouldn't exist just in a ghetto or in a vacuum. You know, it has to be how it relates to, you know, politics, economics, technology, culture, etc. So that's very much what attracted me to the magazine. But in terms of your, you know, if you're maybe don't have a science background, you're not a science journalist, you know, and you're maybe a little bit, you know, it can be quite daunting. I find, you know, I knew very little about epidemiology, and then obviously COVID came along, so I had to kind of mug up and become I'm not an epidemiologist, obviously, but I found a lot of good ones, right? So it's so you can do it. I think in terms of practical stuff, you know, Google Scholar is your friend. You know, you only need like 5 minutes to see who you quickly find who the two sort of dominant authors are, and you know, filter it by the last 5 years. You don't want the sort of emeritus person who, like, you know, retired in 2005, but like look and find. You'll very quickly find who the go-to person is on methane leaks, on EVs, on like extraction around batteries or whatever it is, right? Cities. So that's a good resource, and it's freely open to all of you. It's quick. Again, God, I sound like some sort of shill for PRs now. Press officers at universities are really useful resources, yes. And we'd be so pleased to hear from you, because they don't get a lot of, you know, generally they're desperately trying it, but they are great for finding experts, you know, subject experts, especially if you're on a tight deadline. Also, like intermediaries, so bodies like, I am sure you have your national equivalents in the UK. An organisation I do work with occasionally is the Science Media Centre. So they kind of have effectively a database of, like, you know, and by and large, I know the people I want to go to in my fields, right, and I can find them myself. But like sometimes it'll be so niche, it'll be like, okay, there's this new type of lithium X, like, you know, not lithium ion, you know, lithium phosphate, whatever, new type of battery, and even I can't quite find the go-to person. So an intermediary like that can be quite good. And I'm going to shut up in a second, but the other two last things I would say is science is generally, it's a very open sector, right? And so if you do find one scientist, they will give you other scientists' contacts. They are constructive and helpful, and they won't mind you. You know, in a business world, that would be a bit weird. Like, hi, Shell, could you tell me some other good oil companies to contact? But scientists love that. That's what they live for, right? That's part of their sort of mission. And the last thing I would say is, and this might sound obvious and telling you how to suck eggs, but get the right specialist. So, like, you know, during the COVID was a good example of, like, the amount of times I sort of tearing my hair out watching TV, where you've got, like, someone who's developed a vaccine being asked about, like, you know, what the best mitigation measures are, you know, non-pharmaceutical, for, you know, social distancing. It's like, that is not their expertise. You've got the wrong person. You know, the producer found the wrong person. You know, if, you know, to come back to that CO2 removals example, you know, do you want the person who's the expert on social attitudes, you know, and like buy-in from local communities, or do you want the person who's like the expert on the mechanics of how the machine works? You know, you need to get down to that level of detail and get the right person. Otherwise, you're not serving your readers or your viewers, because you're not getting the right expertise.
Do you wait for something to be peer reviewed before reporting on?
No, we obviously do cover. You know, that's our sort of meat and potatoes. I'm mixing up my stuff. But generally we also report a lot on preprints. So bioarchive and other preprint servers, we sort of, you know, watch them like hawks, like most science journalists do. And the thing we just do is well, two things really, I guess. One is to make clear to readers that it's not been peer reviewed, and this is a paper that has been published on a server. It could be complete Mickey Mouse. We obviously try and add it in a bit more nuanced way than that. And the other thing is like the mask wearing at the start of the pandemic and the efficacy of masks, for example, was a good example. There was not a lot of clarity on that. There were some papers coming out going, okay, if you wear a mask, it might make you be, there was a lot of behavioral science stuff coming out, like going, oh, it'll make you more reckless. And then obviously, so like there was a few papers, like it could have been quite easy to do quite a misleading story off just one of them. So quite often we'll wait till like there's a body of them, you know, so again, that would be one of my general sort of advices with science stuff, is to avoid trying to do too much one paper stuff if you can, especially with preprints.
Yeah, your advice to talk to scientists, in my experience, is spot on, right? They love talking to journalists. We both are in search of truth through evidence, right? So don't ever be shy about calling a journal or calling a scientist. Given all this science and complexity and nuance and not wanting to turn people off halfway through a story, how do you get all that in there when we journalists often face inevitable word count limits or soundbite limits? What's important to get in? How do you?
I can speak to that. Do you want me to speak to that? No, you go first.
I was going to say, I don't know that I have a good answer because I just publish everything. Publish every single word. Come write for me. I won't cut anything from your drafts. But no, I do think that, you know, a little bit of what I alluded to before, making sure that, you know, some of the stuff that gets a little too nitty gritty, I think can often go. But I think that oftentimes if you have like a list of priorities, like for me, I always want to make sure that our climate solutions pieces have a level of narrative to them. I always want to make sure that the reader will be able to, you know, relate the concept back to themselves in their own lives, and then, you know, and then of course the science. And so oftentimes if you get what you need, that kind of reveals itself as what can go.
I mean, just I'm probably the last person to ask, because my editors hate me because I always file long, and writing concise is harder than writing long. But to your question, I find the newsletter format does help because you have a little bit more space. It's kind of the real limit there is like the attention span. Like even your most loyal subscriber is only going to read so much of my crap about EVs, you know. So that is one thing in terms of the format. Another thing is graphs. So data graphics. You can often save. I mean, it's incredible how many stories still spend, you know, like 3 paragraphs doing like the world ranking of like, you know, per capita CO2 emissions or whatever it is, like when you could have just done it with a graph, and you've saved so much time and space, and you've told the story in a better way. Another thing is just like the real basics of like linking to we do like you know, if something is big enough, we'll do explainer articles, you know, what is COP26, what is CO2 removal, so on and so forth. So they're obviously a really great way to just give a shortcut, so you don't always have to have that kind of, you know, the Paris Agreement, you know, you don't want the subclause every time of the 2015 historic deal that, you know, like you can't, you know, I think we can assume at a certain point that readers know that, but still having an explainer article to link to is a great way of avoiding those horrible tangents and making things unreadable. I mean, the last thing point I'd make, because I'm sorry, I'm rambling on a bit, the last point I'd make is, it's interesting about the nitty-gritty, and I totally agree with you, Dayana. It's like you can get lost in it sometimes. Ironically, I also find that with solutions journalism, and you sort of start to get in this a bit, Chris, on the smart city stuff, is with the nitty-gritty is often where you get the answers to where the limits are when you start talking about how the machine works or how the building is going to be built or how much wood there is to actually build. You see, I mean, when you start getting into the really practical, almost the weeds, it feels like from a journalist point of view, that's quite often where you find you do the sort of real journalism in a way of solutions
the funny
journalism.
business.
Yeah, so I don't know. But at the same time, as well as Diana's point of like losing people is obviously a risk as well.
And it depends who as well you're sort of thinking about losing. You know, there's a lot of hand-wringing about the fact that, you know, if you look at attention times on articles, which you can now track in great detail, you know, it falls away pretty quickly, and sometimes people will say, well, you know, only a certain number of people got to the end of that piece. There's different audiences for that piece, right? I mean, if you publish something, anyone can read it, specialists and non-specialists, you know? In the urban space, there are hardcore city nerds, you know, urbanists, architects, urban planners, gentrification activists, cycling aficionados, like people who really want to go into the detail, but there's also a general readership, which is much times bigger. And those people will be coming for the first few paragraphs. You know, often they'll just read the headline. And I think that there's value in that as well. I think a lot of people, that's how they consume media. I mean, you know, not everybody is going to read to the end of a piece. And so, you know, Diana was saying, you know, you need a narrative. I think that is extremely important. I think there needs to be a story at the top of every piece that is engaging. And I think people will then decide for themselves how much detail they want to get into. And if they really do want to go down to the end and get everything, great. I don't think it's a problem, though, if people don't necessarily.
I do want to echo too what you mentioned about the explainers, because we've ran into that as well. And I would think that pretty much any publication that wants to cover climate solutions in a very in-depth way will or has. We kind of made this conscious effort to begin creating a collection of, we call them durables, but essentially just, explainers for every concept or every like major event that is relevant to the beat of climate solutions. And, you know, we just link out heavily. There's these sidebars, and they're evergreen too, which is great for the most part. So anytime, you know, a concept is in the news, we're able to push it back out, or we're able to link to it right away. And yeah, I just wanted to underscore that. That's been incredibly important.
There's
for
also
us.
just like basic traffic, like monetizing stuff kind of reasons, not my world, right? But like, you know, we do a newsletter, like people don't pay for that. You can get that for free today. But, you know, if I push someone back to the site, maybe someone, an advert gets served, maybe someone, becomes a subscriber and starts paying, you know, so there's that aspect of it as well.
Yeah, we do little nuggets as well, call them atoms, not durables, but they're functionally the same thing, you know, on a particular thing. On oceans, there's a concept of flags of convenience, you know, ships, you know, might operate in a particular country and be owned by a particular, company that's based somewhere, but they'll fly the flag of Panama or whatever because environmental regulations are laxer there or whatever, they can get away with stuff. That comes up all the time. You don't want to have to explain it every time, so we just have a little thing that can be plopped into any piece really easily using our content management system. You just write it once, it's a paragraph, and then you just go like, what are flags of convenience? And, you know, it doesn't even, it can close too, right? So people don't need to click on it if they don't want to, but if they're interested, they can, and they can open it. So it's really, sort of like
So it's interesting.
an embedded internal link almost.
Overwhelming, it seems like you all are saying there is no danger of over-explaining on this beat.
I think you can never assume too much knowledge. It's very dangerous to assume too much knowledge because a lot of this stuff is very geeky, very wonky, and most people won't have heard of it, frankly. Yeah.
I don't know, I'm pretty brutal about cutting out stuff that I think isn't going to engage people. I mean, but again, it comes down to audience, right? Because, you know, the Guardian is a general interest platform. It's not a specialized science publication, and you know, there are great specialized science publications that can, and you know, people can go into any level of detail that they want. It's not necessarily always the journalist's role to explain every little detail. It's kind of to give people a story that brings them into this and gets them engaged and caring about it.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think we're probably just kind of coming from the same place too, given our publications, but my goal with every story is to reach as many people as possible, and not just because, you know, we care about page views or what have you, but because I just think so much, like as I said, about climate solutions is empowerment, and, you know, even if it is potentially some sort of climate solutions that maybe like won't come to scale, but a reader coming across that article is now inspired to look into it deeper, or inspired to like care a little bit more about climate change. Like, I know that sounds really earnest, but I think that's where my motivation for like a general audience comes from.
So coming back to what we were talking about earlier about what is a solution story for you, do you guys have a checklist that you have when you approach these stories? Do they need to meet certain bars? There are some checklists out there. For example, the mention of scale to make sure that you're gauging whether or not the solution is actually, you know, could have an impact at scale. Another one you were sort of alluding to earlier was the question of motivation. How do these questions kind of populate your reporting process?
Yeah, I don't know. It's tricky. I mean, I think it's editorial judgment, really. We had a piece recently about these like robot penguins. Some guys built like a bunch of robot penguins and they zoom around through the sea. And the idea is that by being so mobile, they can get into what are called eddies. They're sort of smaller currents that are really hard to study. And so obviously it's a great story because it's a robot penguin and it looks really cute, and you know it's and there's a legitimate scientific sort of reason for them to exist, and it's not like a sort of but there is a company involved in making these and selling them, and they've only got one of them right now really that works. They're going to do 6. It was originally pitched as this very highfalutin AI thing where they were all going to work in tandem and communicate with each other and learn, and you get this sort of vision of like hundreds of thousands of these like self-learning robot penguins flooding the sea.
Absolutely terrifying.
Just terrifying, and so it was a freelance journalist trying to sell the story. So obviously he's trying to sell the story in the most dramatic way possible. But then you're sort of like, he's almost doing the work of the company for them, and it's you really have to interrogate that guy's motivation as well as the company's motivation, because he wants to sell a story, and rightfully so. And I was really torn because I had all these negatives, and then I had robot penguins, and eventually I caved and I did the robot penguins.
I'm really annoyed we didn't get that story. I mean, one question I always ask myself is it replicable? So, Chris gave the example of cities. I was in Finland recently, and I was in there was representatives from Helsinki there and representatives from Singapore, and just the ability to do certain things that Finland were doing were just not possible in Singapore because there's no space. And so I think kind of that's often a question to ask yourself. Like I don't know, I think it's something I've written about a couple of months ago, like on energy storage. There's these quite wacky ideas of doing gravity-based storage. So there's like a UK startup, there's an Australian one, there's a Swiss company. Basically, when electricity is cheap and plentiful, you send a very heavy piece of metal high up, and then you release it. Some people are using mine shafts, some people are using cranes, and like, yeah, cool. It's kind of maybe it's interesting, but it's so location specific. You need, if you're going to stick a crane up, then like, who wants a crane next to where they live? Generally, you need this stuff near where the energy demand is, and there's only so many mines in the world, right? And like, so it's just kind of getting into the nitty gritty of, can this be repeated elsewhere? And that often the city stuff that comes up again and again. Another thing I would list is, and this is maybe coming from a science magazine, is technology readiness levels. There is actually like a scale of like where things are in terms of their maturity. So that is one thing to look at. And often they're very low, like that example I gave you, I think it was like a 2 or a 3, which is like, really far off. Economics, what's the cost per kilowatt hour, per megawatt hour, or whatever the relevant unit is. There's always going to be, again, that CO2 removal example I gave earlier on, like, the cost of that is about $600 per ton of CO2 removed. And now they're doing deals with like corporates, so that corporates who want to meet their net zero targets, or individuals like you and me who feel guilty about the stuff we buy, the too much stuff we buy, you can offset it in a really well verified way. But that is not at the moment, that sort of cost. That is not how we are going to get to the scale we need to on CO2 removals. Tree planting is less than $100 a ton, like quite a lot less in many examples. So always have to look at the economics of it, which comes back to, is this going to fly? Is it going to have scale? And another thing I always try and keep in mind is cultural factors. So kind of which again comes back to putting things in place. So, I write a lot quite often about food, and it's quite easy to be quite glib about like, hey, let's just all stop, beef farming, and let's just all like, you guys just plant cereals, or like you go and get rid of it, kill all your cows, don't get any more, and plant a load of trees. And it just ignores so many, when you then go and talk to some farmers, it ignores so many cultural factors around, okay, I know about animal husbandry, I don't know anything about forestry, right, for starters, so there's a skills thing. Or just really basic stuff like, this farmer's been, I was talking to someone in East Anglia, which is in the east of England recently, and like, he's like, this farmer's been in my family for, I think it was like 5 or 6 generations. You don't want to be the farmer who let the farm stop being a farm. That is, how it will go down in the sort of collective memory of your family. So I just think remembering those things that are often nothing to do with climate change, that are, the cultural stuff, which is often very place. I mean, I know that sounds like super obvious, but it's often
No,
left out, and you know, especially in the food argument, you know, and I find I'm guilty of doing it as well, of being too sort of glib about how easy that is to do, you know, that transition. So.
I mean, these are the realities that make solutions journalism tricky, and in some
And
cases
interesting.
booby-trapped. So, actually, to the point of motivation, one of the questions I ask when I get a PR release is how badly they need me to write this story, right? Like, why do they need the press? And you know, maybe it's legit, but maybe there's a grant pending or something. So,
Do you want the Burger King example?
go for it. Yeah.
I mean, it's like, you know, sort of such a journalistic cliche of like follow the money, or like, you know, think about is a status quo business model just trying to be preserved here? You know, like in the world of energy, you could think of something like blue hydrogen, and you know, companies like Shell, lo and behold, have got like really big into blue hydrogen. What does Shell do? A lot of gas. You know, so that there's obvious thing. Russia also ironically wanted to become a big player in hydrogen and sell that out to Europe. I'm not sure that's going to work out now. The Burger King story is like a sort of, they did this thing about a low, I covered it because it had a sort of semi-sciencey angle, and they commissioned some scientists. I think it was somewhere like Stanford, like somewhere like, gave it sort of a gravitas that it shouldn't have had. And it was about this like low methane burger that they had piloted in probably like 2 Burger King branches in the US. Like, you know, they'd made out like it was national, it clearly wasn't. But what it turned out was, on a really basic level of like, you know, interrogating and probing like the claims, what they'd done is they found that if they fed this, I can't remember, it's like 30 cattle or something, they fed them different additives in their diet. They basically added lemongrass and some other stuff, and that did reduce the methane emissions. But then as soon as I started phoning around asking some researchers who are not paid by Burger King, it turns out that like lemongrass is really expensive, which you probably know if you've ever bought it, and it's in your fridge, and it's the thing that never gets used, like it does in my house. B, what happens is actually it turns out ruminants, their gut actually adapts quite quickly. So if you know, like the lemongrass thing would work for like a couple of months. I'm making the time scale up, right? But then they adapt, and you lose the gain. So on a really basic level, it wouldn't have worked and couldn't have been scaled because of the cost. But then I think the thing you just need to do is step back as well and go, okay, you need to zoom out a level and go, is this a straw man? You know, is this actually, you know, is the solution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from food, meat that is like incrementally, you know, X tons of methane like lower, or is the solution moving to more plant-based diets? I mean, I'll let people make up their own mind on that.
Yeah, we were looking into the into shipping emissions, and they're opening up, you know, the Northwest Passage, and it was framed to our reporter by a shipping company that it was a good thing that the Northwest Passage was being opened up, because it would mean shorter shipping routes, and therefore a lot less bunker fuel being burned, and therefore much, you know, lower amounts of black carbon, and, you know, less heating in the Arctic, and generally a kind of a good thing. And, you know, in a way you sort of think like, I guess that's true, but the only reason that's happening is because of the climate emergency. Like, that's not a good thing. And also, you know, just because, as we learned on cities, just because you build, you know, more efficient roads or whatever, it doesn't reduce car traffic. Like, if you open up the Northwest Passage to shipping, you know, it's not going to reduce the total amount of shipping miles, because way more ships all of a sudden are going to rely on this model. The entire global economy can still rely on global shipping. In fact, it makes it a lot easier, which means way more ships. So you do have to kind of think through the ramifications, don't you?
You just made me think as well, just as sort of an aside, is shipping is a fascinating area, because what I find really the most interesting solutions ones is where the solution isn't obvious. So you mentioned wind and solar power at the start. Now, that is going to be the backbone of the world's energy system. There's no doubt. There's a pretty strong consensus, not just among scientists, but amongst the business community on that. But what is really interesting is I find really fascinating is areas like that, like where we don't quite know, no one quite knows what, you know, is it green ammonia? Is it methanol? Is it something else? And is it just demand reduction? We just need to all consume less stuff so there's less ships sailing around the world. It's probably quite a lot of that. But, you know, those are the most, I love those subjects. Maybe that's just me, but like where the solution is not obvious, that for me is where it's really interesting and journalistically interesting.
One thing to your original question too about, you know, what's on your checklist, I think that when looking for solutions to cover in a climate solution story, it's really important to consider whose story and whose solution you're elevating. So one thing that's on my checklist as an editor and you know, on our reporter's checklist as well is, you know, keeping in mind that with the fight against climate change, so often marginalized communities are at the forefront of it. So often women are at the forefront of it, and their stories aren't told at the same level that others are often. So prioritizing that in your research, in the stories that you want to tell, I think is really important in this beat. I think one thing that we found too is we place a very big focus on covering climate solutions within indigenous communities in the US. And once you start doing that, you know, so many of the stories are actually like, you know, these indigenous practices are, you know, so normal, obviously, in these communities, and we consider them climate solutions, but the communities consider them just the way of life. And so finding stories like in that arena, I think, is really important to elevate and prioritize in your coverage.
Great.
I think we have 15 minutes, so I'd like to open it up to questions. Yeah? Does anybody, what I'll do is I'll take a few verbally and then I'll repeat them into the microphone for the recording. It's okay. Any questions? I have more questions, so if you don't, then I do. Okay. Yeah?
I don't know if I speak loud enough. So, my question is especially to the Washington Post about like the individuals, because there's always the question of should individuals be blamed and should they be the solution, or should it be more like international actors, and how do you balance that? But of course, all people can't see that.
So the question was the role of the individual in the reporting and whether they're part of, they should be in focus as part of the problem, as we're also focusing on how individuals might be part of the, or have agency in being part of the solution.
I'm really glad you asked that because I was hoping we would talk about it today in general. It's something that I wrestle with every single day as we kind of have made this conscious effort to move toward utility journalism in the climate solution space and give readers like how-tos and guides and, you know, news you can use. I think that, you know, climate change is an institutional systemic problem, and hopefully everyone knows that, but, you know, to your point, we have to be very clear about that. So, I mean, we've even gone as far as to like start some of our articles with, you know, your actions aren't responsible, like directly responsible for climate change, but the steps that you take are still worthwhile, you know? And so finding that balance is extremely difficult. I don't know that I like have the right answer for it, but the way I've been thinking about it is, you know, we've seen so much readership and so much like, so many questions around things like I mentioned, like how do I, you know, fireproof my home? How do I, you know, put solar panels on my roof, that type of stuff. And, you know, keeping in mind that it's not this individual's responsibility, but who am I to tell them, you know, don't put solar panels on your roof, you know? Like, I don't feel right doing that either. So I think it's maybe this question of making sure your coverage is holistic and includes, you know, the accountability that is so important in this sphere, but also provides, you know, utility to readers and empowers them to feel like they can make a difference because they can.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And you know, we did a series on concrete. We did the Concrete Week, and you know, one of the tricky things about concrete is that unlike, say, you know, plastic pollution, where it is quite easy to get people to stop using less plastic, and there's this whole kind of, the UK tabloids did a big thing around plastic straws, and with concrete, it's a bit like, okay, concrete is one of the most destructive materials on earth, but what can you really do about it? I mean, you know, you and I don't pour a lot of concrete in our daily life. Were you gonna not walk on the sidewalk? Like, you kind of have to use it. It's the base of every building. You know, and it's tricky, so I think, you know, we did do a piece, which was, you know, what you can do, but really, absolutely, it's a global problem, a systemic problem, and the climate crisis is a global systemic problem, and trying to blame individuals for it is really abdicating global responsibility. And, you know, you see it a lot. I mean, a lot of governments these days really don't want to have to take on problems that they can't solve, and they blame individuals, you know. And, in the UK right now, I'm just totally unrelated, but like with the pandemic, essentially the government has said it's no longer our concern. It's entirely down to the individual, and as a result, cases have skyrocketed. But anyway, that's a bit of a separate.
I mean, you obviously
Beef.
haven't seen me, Chris, in my yard at the weekend with the mixer. I mean, I don't disagree with anything either of you have just said. I suppose I feel a little bit like the pendulum has almost swung too far on that argument the other way, in terms of individuals sort of being left off the hook. So clearly in our coverage, as across the field, we make clear that a lot of stuff is going to be collective, systemic change. Voting, investment in the public sphere. You can't walk around the road without the concrete on the. But I think as well that argument can go too far to sort of let us off the hook for business as usual in our own personal lives. And obviously for a lot of people, the cost of some of the measures to, like, say, change their home or change their transport or so on will be out of their budget and out of their reach. However, for a lot of the readers of the publications in this room, they really are in their reach. Those people are just choosing to spend their money on other things like holidays and stuff. And I'm guilty of that to a degree myself as well. I could do far more. But I suppose what I feel is you can let people off the hook a bit too much like that. But we also do a lot of news. I really like doing news you can use stuff, right? I did a thing recently on like what high energy prices in the UK means for all the sort of green home renovations you can do. And you have to caveat, you have to present it very carefully because of the fact that for a lot of people it's more like, can I eat or can I heat my home? But for
It's worth mentioning too that the IPCC report last week uniquely and interestingly advocated for governments to legislate or pass policies to change behavior, to, for example, introducing no car zones or encouraging through policy less eating of meat. So the scientists themselves are also looking at how we can, change hearts and minds and behaviors. Michael?
A lot of climate solutions that we are presented with today involve certain amounts of geoengineering, changing, permanent changes to the planet that, the ramifications from those are not completely understood. Do you have strategies or approaches to big, long-term solutions, ideas that you're presented with like that are both realistic about the consequences that we could see from geoengineering and the potential for those types of solutions?
So just to repeat the question, he asked that today we're hearing a lot of news about new experimental climate solutions in the realm of geoengineering. They're large-scale manipulations of Earth systems, whether it's injecting sulfates into the stratosphere or pouring ion into the oceans so that they absorb more carbon dioxide. And his question was whether the panelists had strategies for tackling those in terms of the long-term unknowns and the lack of regulation around them globally. Go for it.
So thank you for the question. I suppose, first of all, just a language point, I would sort of distinguish geoengineering from CO2 removals. I think they are two separate things. I think on the geoengineering thing, I guess what's interesting about geoengineering is there's not a lot happening. There's a lot of modeling and there's a lot of talk, and in the US, the National Academy of Science, basically they didn't quite put it. They are calling for more research into it, which is obviously different from deployment. I would support more research. Obviously Greenpeace and others like ETC in Canada and others would argue that's a slippery road to deployment, but I think you need to know. But I mean, I guess it's notable, like one of the most you've mentioned about. Shields in space, solar geoengineering as it's called, and like David Keefe and Frank Koich at Harvard, who are, behind that project. They've been talking about that for God, I feel like, as long as I was been a journalist. But, that was meant to happen in Sweden last year. There was a massive kickback in Swedish civil society, and it got postponed. It may or may not happen this year. They want to basically put a balloon up and launch it off Sweden and then try spraying some particles in the stratosphere. It will be a vanishingly small amount. It won't cause any damage because it will be so small. But clearly, the issue for people is it sets a precedent. So, I guess I feel like there's a lot more talk than actual material things happening, and is the first thing. But I suppose more to your question, yes, we obviously interrogate all the kind of like moral hazard argument of it all. We interrogate the other environmental side effects. So the classic example is BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So this idea that you grow some sort of biomass and then you burn it, and then you capture the CO2 emissions. You know, there's been 1,000,001 research papers on. The one that gets quoted all the time is that if you wanted BECCS at the level you needed globally to tackle climate change, you basically have to use all the water that India uses. So, you know, it's like, yeah, and plant and cover in it. I think I've got it the wrong way around. I think it's actually the area of land is the size of India, and then you need loads more water. Anyway, you know, so lots of these things do obviously have these massive other side effects, and I think it's just behoving on us to point those out. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Next question in the back? Yeah, you with the pen in your hand, yeah.
I'm curious about the internal discussions that you have in your news operations. I mean, we live in a world where a crypto story gets more clicks than carbon capture, or celebrity stories get more views than, say, green concrete. So I just want to get a sense of what's the argument you make internally to get your story either on the front page or better placement? Because there's a lot of news organizations where we don't have this level of enlightened people that would say this story merits more space, more time, more interest.
So the question was, in the age of clicks, what sort of internal discussions do we have in our newsrooms to persuade our colleagues to allow or promote these stories versus a story that might get, you know, more clicks on celebrities or crypto? Yeah. Dayana, why don't you answer that?
Yeah, I guess I am lucky in this way because I do think that the Post has just put such a big priority on these stories. You know, every time an IPCC report comes out, like that story is going to be on the front page no matter what else happened that day, which, you know, is very fortunate. But I do think that there's an argument to be made that there are obviously topics that readers gravitate toward, but then there are also topics that we bring to the readers, and so it's making those conscious decisions to put it on the homepage, to send an alert, to, you know, I don't know, like put together a social media campaign around the piece. I usually start with vouching or campaigning for those types of things within newsrooms, and then, you know, meeting the readers there. I think that one thing that is a very terrible thing, but I guess has worked in the favor of this question, is last summer we definitely saw, I think in our newsroom, a pretty big turning point because, you know, like the US was like, the West Coast was on fire, there were like heat domes, and, you know, that really mirrors what we're going to just like experience as humans. This issue just keeps getting bigger and affecting more and more people. And so with that in parallel, I think the story becomes, unfortunately, more appealing to more people. And so kind of, I don't know, capitalizing on that, I suppose, is the way to usually get our stories in front of the biggest readership.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think we found actually, though, that environment coverage is extremely well read, and people really do want to read it quite regularly. You know, 3 or 4 of the top 10 stories on the site are environment stories. Many of them are climate related. Some of them are disaster oriented, as you mentioned. A lot are not. So I think we're seeing a big change in how readers engage. And the other thing is that, you know, I think the sort of click chasing model is something that, you know, this has been discussed at other panels here, is really, you know, not a sustainable one. And a lot of organizations, including the Guardian, but a lot of smaller publications as well, have turned to a reader support model where, you know, through a variety of means, reader engagement is a lot more important than sheer number of people who might have clicked on you. So it doesn't matter if your story went viral on Google or whatever. What matters is whether or not readers are coming to you regularly. And in that case, then you don't need to feed them stuff that you think is just going to be momentarily, you know, a bit of sugar for them. You know, they come to you because they want stuff that's reported in more depth. So hopefully we can move away from that world.
Yeah, from my days before climate change was in the news, I would always try to make sure that a story either spoke to readers' health or their wallet. Those are the two things that people are always interested in hearing about.
Question?
Just when do you see you'll be, as in the solutions be rather than, people like maybe, sort of getting the same breaking news, but maybe not breaking, but regular sort of news pace that other economic needs might get? Because most of the time, if a solutions company, carbon capture company, maybe they get a multi-billion investment from somebody, or, they pitch you something and then you go there and you interview them, and, that's it. Those are the two sorts of, let's call them news bank, maybe, that I can think of when reading pieces like, startups and the like. And also, these are not, most of the time, these are not going to be listed companies, right? So you're not going to be, they're not going to have quarterly earnings where you can sort of give an update on their business plans and everything. At what point, maybe, down the road in years, do you see actually, the field being big enough in economic terms that you actually go there and every few months you're like, oh, actually I can report on how they're doing on this project or this or that, because they passed, if you want, the pilot phase?
I think the question was, when people are starting new pilots, at what point do you jump in, given the need for more news?
Well, rather, yeah, as in, when do you see this happening right now, that you can go back to a story and say, oh, people are going to want an update on that?
So it was about whether or not there's a responsibility in following up on the solutions we report on perhaps 6 or 12 months later?
And an ability as well, because, a lot of these might be still, we're still in pilot phase, that's it, come back in 24 months.
Okay.
I don't really sort of see any, I don't really distinguish, we don't badge our stuff as solutions journalism, and I don't really feel like it operates at a different pace. We just treat it all as one.
Yeah, I agree. And if you're going to follow up on something, usually you'd want there to be another story. That's what I would say.
We are at time, guys. Thank you so much. And thank you so much. It was really
Thank you.
interesting.